It takes more than sheer ineptitude for an NHL franchise to go more than a half century without winning a Stanley Cup. For a championship drought to span the better part of a lifetime, a team also needs a healthy dose of poor timing and bad luck. And on one fateful night in 1993, those factors conspired to further torment the long-suffering Toronto Maple Leafs, whose championship run was derailed by a pivotal non-call in Game 6 of the conference finals against the Los Angeles Kings. An egregious officiating oversight that ultimately became one of the most memorable chapters in the long and painful history of hockey's most famous losers. Over the last 5.5 decades, as the Maple Leafs championship drought stretched to historic lengths, it's grown increasingly difficult to see them as a legitimate Stanley Cup threat. However, back in the winter of '92, the revamped Leafs demanded to be taken seriously after stumbling along as an afterthought for much of the preceding decade plus. Following the death of longtime owner Harold Ballard in 1990, general manager Cliff Fletcher had reshaped the Leafs in his image, unbothered by the famously meddlesome Ballard, and Fletcher's wheelings and dealings ultimately turned Toronto from a bottom feeder into a powerhouse. His most impactful move? Landing Doug Gilmour in a 10-player mega deal with the Calgary Flames midway through the 1991-1992 campaign.
A deal that changes the face of both Toronto and Calgary. The Leafs and Flames moving 10 players in a deal both teams hope will revive struggling starts.
The two-way superstar had helped Calgary to a Stanley Cup title in 1989 while averaging a point per game for his career, and as the 92-93 season dawned, the new-look Leafs, featuring Gilmour, a new head coach in Pat Burns, a highly touted young goaltender named Felix Potvin, and a recently drafted Russian star named Nikolai Borshevsky, were hard to write off. And they were also hard to beat. Gilmour set a career high in points and took home the Selke Award as the league's best defensive forward. Both Potvin and Borshevsky turned in tremendous rookie seasons, and the Leafs broke the franchise record in wins and points, finishing 44-29-11 and ultimately snapping a 2-year playoff drought. They may not have been as talented as the mighty Pittsburgh Penguins or as intimidating as the Chicago Blackhawks, but as the postseason unfolded, the Leafs looked increasingly like the team of destiny, and like they might finally unburden themselves from the weight of their own dubious history. Pitted against the 47-win Detroit Red Wings in the first round, the Leafs clawed back from a 2-0 deficit in the best-of-7 to secure their first playoff series win since 1987, with their series-clinching Game 7 victory coming on the road in overtime.
Clark shoving it to the corner. Out front again, Rouse! Scores! Scores! The Leafs win it! The Leafs defeat the Detroit Red Wings in overtime. 2 minutes, 35 seconds in. This has been an unbelievable turn of events.
Then, in a second-round dogfight against the St. Louis Blues that started off with consecutive double overtime odysseys, Toronto once again emerged victorious in 7 games, with Potvin notably putting up a .948 save percentage over the course of the series. Suddenly, the Leafs found themselves on the precipice of their first trip to the Stanley Cup Finals since 1967, when Toronto famously defeated the Montreal Canadiens and re-established themselves as champions of the 6-team league in the final season before NHL expansion. At long last, the Leafs were knocking on the door again. There was just one problem, and it was a big one. Well, technically it was a great one. The Leafs' quest to end their drought would have to go through Wayne Gretzky and the Los Angeles Kings, who were pretty desperate themselves after making the playoffs in each of the previous 6 seasons and bringing home 0 banners. They weren't nearly as consistent as Toronto during the regular season due to an injury to Gretzky, and actually traded away future Hall of Famer Paul Coffey midway through the campaign, a damning self-appraisal by LA's front office. But between Gretzky, Luc Robitaille, and Jari Kurri, the Kings had plenty of offensive firepower, and critically, they were peaking at the right time. The Kings wrapped up each of their first 2 playoff series in 6 games, with Gretzky recording a whopping 23 points across those dozen contests. And ultimately, with hockey's most desperate franchise going up against the single most awesome player in the history of the sport, Leafs-Kings promised to be a showdown for the ages, one of the most entertaining conference finals matchups ever. And it didn't disappoint. Tensions ran high from the opening face-off in Game 1, a commanding Maple Leafs victory that memorably descended into chaos after Gilmour got leveled by Marty McSorley.
The Leafs coasting home to victory here in Game 1. Anderson comes in. Gilmore was hit inside the line by McSorley, and this is going to draw Clark and McSorley into a rocket. They're throwing punches. Oh, Clark is nailing McSorley. Now McSorley comes back. Gilmore was hit inside the line. He's still down. He hasn't moved. Gilmore trying to get up. McSorley was grabbed by Clark, who threw that hit on Gilmore.
I don't know whether he's talking to LA King players. No, he's not. He's talking to Melrose.
Look
and
out.
Burns is trying
Look
to get
out.
down at Melrose. Behind the Leaf bench, there's Burns telling Melrose, if you want to play that way, you're going to have to go through me too.
The bad blood then spilled over into Game 2, a 3-2 win for LA in which Gilmore arguably got away with a headbutt on McSorley, an infraction that, if called, has a game misconduct penalty attached to it. All that extracurricular stuff notwithstanding though, it was the Maple Leafs who found themselves in the driver's seat late in the series, with Toronto surging ahead 3-2 with an overtime victory in Game 5. With only one win separating them from a long-awaited trip to the Stanley Cup Finals and a potential Game 7 coming in the friendly environs of Maple Leaf Gardens, Toronto was in a decidedly enviable spot as they took the ice for Game 6. What ensued, however, was one of the most traumatic games in the franchise's tortured history. Despite grabbing a 1-0 lead less than 60 seconds in, the Maple Leafs trailed 4-2 after 40 minutes of play, and as the third period loomed, the prospect of a seventh and decisive game seemed increasingly inevitable. However, Wendell Clark had other ideas. The Maple Leafs' vaunted captain practically willed his team back into the game in the third, scoring a pair of goals to complete a hat-trick and send the game into overtime. Only not before Leafs winger Glenn Anderson got called for a roughing penalty with 12 seconds left in regulation, which meant that the Kings, who had already scored 3 power play goals that night, would be starting the sudden death extra frame with a man advantage. And sure enough, Los Angeles took immediate control in overtime, winning the opening faceoff before dumping it into Toronto's zone and setting up their attack. Before long, Gretzky had the puck along the half-boards with time and space to operate, and he went for the kill.
Blake for Gretzky. Gretzky moving toward the net now. The shot, that's blocked. And it hurt Gilmore. He stopped the shot. It hurt him. He fell. And the play was called.
However, contrary to Bob Cole's initial assessment, it wasn't Gretzky's shot that sent Gilmore to the ice. Rather, it was Gretzky's stick.
At the top of the screen, here's the shot. McCowan blocks it. It comes back out, Gilmore gets it, and there's where Gretzky's stick came up and hit Gilmore.
With the benefit of replay, it's clear as day. Gretzky had high stick Gilmore, and he'd drawn blood. Under NHL rules at the time, the infraction should have resulted in a game misconduct for number 99, which obviously would have dramatically changed the complexion of the game and afforded the Leafs some serious momentum. Except referee Kerry Fraser never saw it. And apparently, neither did Ron Finn or Kevin Collins, his 2 linesmen.
And there's Kerry Fraser checking with the linesman. The linesman can call high sticking penalty.
So, no penalty was assessed. Even though Gretzky's high stick was plainly obvious to the audience watching on TV at home, the Leafs' protestations went for naught. Gilmore's bloody chin notwithstanding, Gretzky not only stayed in the game, but he stayed on the ice. And the Kings still had a power play. And mere moments after that pivotal non-call, the Leafs' frustration turned into devastation. I bet you can guess who scored the game winner for LA.
And Zazzle takes the puck away from Robitaille. Robitaille gets it back center. They score! Gretzky scores! And the Los Angeles Kings defeat the Maple Leafs. And there is, in fact, a Game 7 coming up at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, Saturday night at 8.
To say that the Leafs and their fans were apoplectic about the non-call in the Game 6 loss would be a dramatic understatement. Some were downright conspiratorial about Fraser's non-call.
But people, let me just pursue 2 points, because a lot of people who are Leaf supporters think this is a conspiracy to get the LA Kings into the final.
Hey.
Oh, you agree with that? No, that's ridiculous to agree with that.
I didn't agree with none. I just said, hey, you said it, not me.
No. Well, so you disagree or you agree with the fans that feel that way?
Hey, you're telling the story, kid.
Oh, I said a lot of people feel that way who are supporting the Leafs, understandably. No, of course not.
In fact, the non-call generated so much furor that the NHL's head of officiating, Brian Lewis, went on Hockey Night in Canada less than 48 hours later to try to defuse the situation. As he explained it, there were, quote, elements of doubt in real time that justified a non-call. Specifically, uncertainty over whether Gretzky might have clipped Gilmour with his follow-through, which is not a penalty, and uncertainty over whether Gilmour might have been hit by a bouncing puck. However, as Fraser himself admitted years later, he just missed the call. As he wrote in the Players Tribune in 2016, "The honest-to-God truth is, I didn't see it. I had to eat it. I said, no penalty." And ultimately, 2 nights later, that non-call was cemented as one of the most momentous officiating blunders in NHL history, and perhaps the definitive embodiment of the Leafs' ongoing misfortune. In Game 7 in Toronto, Gretzky almost single-handedly propelled the Kings to victory, netting a hat-trick and adding an assist in a series-clinching 5-4 win for LA. For the first time ever, the Kings were headed to the Stanley Cup Finals, while the Leafs were headed for yet another summer of shaking their heads. And more than a quarter century later, the Leafs and their fans are still shaking their heads. They were already sick of losing by '93, but 3 decades later, they're defined by it. As of this writing, Toronto still hasn't played in a Stanley Cup final since 1967. Since the non-call, moreover, the Leafs have only made it to the conference finals 3 times. And again, as of this writing, the Leafs own the NHL's longest active postseason series win drought. Ultimately, their futility has persisted for so long that it's hard to imagine them ever winning. But there's no question that that trajectory and the Leafs' very identity was shaped in part by Kerry Fraser, Wayne Gretzky, and the high stick that never happened. Thanks for watching. If you like this video and want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button.